So today I'm going to be showing you how to paint Slaanesh Demon skin. It's traditionally a very pale grey colour with hints of purple, going to really darken some recesses and keeping it really bright across like a lot of the large flatter areas of skin. I've chosen this model because it has several features to it that lend itself to those techniques for us to try. With the legs underneath this robe and down inside, we can get a lot more of those purpley deep colours in there to show that transition in the skin tones. Around the belly button, again, we're going to have that dark centre, but brighter colours around the edge, so we'll get some nice transitions there. On the claw coming from this right arm, traditionally that goes into a sort of a very deep purple colour, so again, we can practice our glazing and transitions over this side. We've got the face, which will give us some nice attempts at detail, and then we've got the large, flat sort of open arm and back of the body, which again has deep crevices in it, but we'll keep that very strong, bright colour, and then be able to work in those deeper purples as well for some variety. The colours we're going to go with are basing the entirety of the skin with Celestial Grey, because it keeps that nice, pure, clean colour that the skin traditionally has. Then, depending on how dark we want it to go, we can glaze deeper with these three colours: Slaanesh Grey, Demonette Hide, and Phoenician Purple. The Phoenician Purple is going to be purely for the absolute deepest recesses, and not a huge amount else, because it is very strong. An alternative Phoenician Purple could be Nagaroth Night if you wanted to. It is that little bit darker, so I would recommend the Phoenician Purple, but either one of those will do. The Demonette Hide is going to be the majority of our dark recesses, because again, it's that bit brighter, so it ties in naturally to the skin tone without being too dark. And the Slaanesh Grey is how we're going to do something called soft shading, which is where we imply shape on the model by shading in or glazing in the curvature of where bits of the skin will start to catch shadow, won't be too much darker. A good example of that would be, on your own hand, we'd have our brighter colour along most of it, but we'd do a soft shade just to start the colour transition on the inside of my fingers, and then go into our darker colour, and then our absolute deepest right in the recess down there. At the other end though, we do have Ulthuan Grey for the majority of our highlights. Again, it's a bit brighter than Celestial Grey, so it gives us that colour transition to what we need for our brightest colours. And then if you have some absolute really bright reflections that you're planning, maybe your demon is under some harsh alien sun or is getting loads of light thrown at it from something else, you could move up to something like the white grey for the absolute brightest highlights. I wouldn't really go much higher than that, because skin itself naturally isn't hugely reflective. If you look at my hand again, my nails would be quite reflective, but there's very little. Maybe the tips just next to my fingers are reflecting nearly pure white light, but again, it's not quite there just because of how naturally dull skin often is. So that's why I'll be using those colours. What I'm going to do to start with is just make myself a little more room, and I can bring my wet palette over and my main colour, give it a really good shake. Always shake every paint before use. It helps mix the pigment and the rest of the chemicals together, which is what we want for a nice smooth flow. I'm going to put some water on my wet palette as well. Not a huge amount, just enough to have a little reservoir for me to call on. And then I'm going to get some of my Celestial Grey on my palette. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and keep my palette organised, and I'm going to leave space for my brighter colours sort of at the top, and then I'm going to work my way down to the darker colours. And if I need to thin paint out, I'm going to work my way down the palette towards me. And that means I'll have my thickest colours at the top, transitioning to shades and then glazes, and I'll have brightest to darkest. And having that sort of like organisation on your palette really helps you when you're sort of moving between glazes. If you're doing transitions, you can get those different colours ready to go, which really helps. Right, now there's that paint on the palette. Give my paint a quick wash, my brush a quick wash, sorry. And then, as before, I'm just going to get my little bit of water, a little bit of the paint, thin it out a bit, pull my brush to a nice point, and then I'm just going to start layering this Celestial Grey. I'm going to be quite messy because when I cover these robes in, they're going to be a very dark purple, so they'll very easily cover over any mistakes I make at this level. I'm using a size 1 brush because it lets you put a lot of paint in your paint well at the tip of the brush, but without absolutely flooding the model. And we do have to get into some detailed areas. And even though, again, as I said, it's going to be easy to go back over and recover things, I don't want to make it absolutely a monumental task for me to go back and cover those over later on. So while I'm not too bothered, I may as well make a bit of an effort to make sure that I don't have to do as much work later on. So this step is essentially just covering the entirety of the skin. what I'm just doing there is, if your brush starts to split a bit at the end, just roll it back on your thumb and you can pull it back into shape. Alternatively, again, you can pull it back on the palette and bring it to a nice tip again on the palette. At the same time, you'll notice I'm bracing my hands together to help reduce shaking, and that will give you a bit more control over where you're applying your paint. It is looking quite patchy at the moment, don't worry, it is like that. We're using obviously a very pale grey over black, so it's going to take more than one layer to ensure that we've got a nice, smooth, flat coverage. I'd expect it to take 3 or 4 layers. Don't try and rush it, because with skin, obviously it's very smooth. The more layers you do with very thin paint, the smoother it will be. If you rush and try and apply it too quickly, you will end up with brush marks in your paint. I'm just going in up the leg underneath here. Bring it right up to the base of her hair. And again, I'm just going to make sure I cover everything here. So I'm getting, there is a little bit going on these horns coming out of the side of her body and out of her shoulder. But again, we can tidy up that transition later. As this is going to be the largest colour on the model, and it is obviously going to be the thinnest, brightest colour, it's much easier to cover it over later than it is to make a mistake now and have to go back and sort it out later. So it's better to ensure that you've over-covered than under-covered. I go all the way along this claw. Even though we're going to really darken it down later, it's great to have, as I said, complete coverage over everything. But we are going to really change the colour of what this arm looks like in later steps. Bring my brush to a point again, continuing. Always trying to make sure that I have my hands touching in some way, this time using the cork as a brace. What that does is it gives you just that much more control over where your brush is going. When you're painting the face, obviously do try to not flood all the detail and build up the paint too much, otherwise it might start to obscure it. So what I've just done is given my brush a quick wipe down, and then I'm pulling some more of the paint off it. So obviously I've left the first coat to dry, and you can see it is incredibly patchy. It's what we expected. We're working with a very pale grey over black. So what we're just going to do, a little bit more water, a bit more paint, and then we're just going to go back over again. We're just going to work at this until it's a nice smooth layer and a consistent colour across all of the skin. Keep making sure that the tip of our brush is nice and pointy and has a great tip to it. If you feel like your paint is too thin, just take a little bit from your well, add it to the mix, and then start painting again. So that is our second coat dry. As you can see, it's still patchy, so we're going to go again and we're going to recover everything once more. That's my third coat dry, and it's starting to get there. It is pretty consistent across almost all of the skin, but there are a couple of darker areas that are showing through. So once again, I'm going to go back and do another thin layer. Now, I have started to run out of paint on my palette, so obviously I'm just going to add a little bit more, do what I was doing before, make it a thin amount of paint, and get it on the model. So with my fourth layer completed, it's a little bit hard to see obviously under the harsh light because we are using a very white colour which will reflect a lot of light in this circumstance, but it is very smooth across all of the areas of skin that we wanted. The only areas where it's patchy are where I've caught some of the cloth next to it, or some of the bangles on the arms or bits of hair, for example, where we're not actually going to want the colour later on, so that doesn't matter. But over the rest of where we're wanting this grey, it's smooth, it's consistent, and it's a nice solid colour, ready for us to start applying darker colours to. Now the reason obviously we started with this brighter colour and are now going to paint in the dark colours is because it will take less layers for us to put the dark colours on the lighter colours than it is to put the lighter colours on the darker colours. So if we'd started with our darkest purples, for example, we'd be building up layer after layer after layer for hours to try and get that smooth, consistent coat over it. Whereas when you're painting in the darkness, it only takes a couple of one or two layers per darker colour that you want to go down. So it saves you time overall, it puts less paint on your model so that the detail is obscured, and it's quicker and easier for you to do. So what I've done is I've got some of my Slaanesh grey on my palette. As before, I'm going to take a bit from my well of paint, I'll take a bit from my well of water, I'm going to start thinning it down. Now what I'm going to want to do at this step is make it much thinner than my previous paint, because we're going to do something called soft shading, which I mentioned at the start of the video. And the point of soft shading is to help imply shape on your model. So areas like the belly, obviously we've got these two lines where the abdominal muscles are much higher than the rest of the skin, or would reflect more when viewing this in real life. But then we've got these recesses in here where it's not necessarily going to be incredibly dark because the belly's quite flat, so it's not going to catch loads of shadow, but it is going to be a little bit darker than some of the tighter skin of the abdominals. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our very thin paint in a small amount. In fact, you can almost see that it's not really actually applying too much colour at all. And that's exactly what we want, because we're now going to paint in where curves are going to be. So this is going to be right where the muscles sort of start to change. It's going to be down underneath the knee, where you'd have a bit of shadow underneath the knee, but again, not too much shadow. In real life, when you have some skin, you have predominantly 90% of your skin is this sort of like one reflective colour, and then it goes really dark in the shadows and the recesses, but there's not a huge amount of transition in between. What we're trying to do is imply that there's curves as there are around my fingers, and we're going to be using our soft shading to do that. So we're really just going to lightly apply this where we think the skin starts to curve, and that's going to help imply that the model is not flat. Now obviously we're painting a not flat surface, so you'd think that you'd be able to see that normally, but painting these colours in helps imply that effect even further. So anywhere where there's a bit of curve underneath something, so down here underneath the calf muscles, I'm going to start, see I'm using a very sort of curving motion to help build up where that curvature of the calf muscle is going to be. Then down here around the toes, I'm going to start putting in a bit of this lighter purple where that's going to be. And I'm really not using much paint, and it's really not too thick. But what it's going to start doing over several layers, again, not going to want to absolutely flood our model with this, it's going to start implying that there's some purple texture, purple colour to the skin, and it's going to do it in a way that helps imply that it's because of shadow and because of how the skin's changing, which is exactly what we want. So again, under the arm here, it's quite reflective in this light, but we're just going to add some darker purple in there. And the reason we're using the Slaanesh grey for this, rather than the darker colour at this stage, is we want to build up our transitions to our deeper colours. So I'm going to line all the way down the spine. That is going to end up much darker, I know. I'm planning that in my head. But for the moment, we're just going to go in lightly with a light purple. I'm just going to build up this colour transition. How deep you want to go overall is also entirely up to you. The Games Workshop range obviously keeps the demons quite bright on a lot of their smaller models. On the bigger ones, you have some really large colour transitions into really, really deep purples on the skin, less so on these smaller models. Personally, I do like those deep transitions, so I will be putting some of those across more of the model than is necessarily on the website. It's up to you as to whether you want to do as much or as little as you want, based on the number of layers you want to put in, or the time or the effect that you're going for, or how you just imagine demons to look. Because obviously, coming from the realm of imagination, it's entirely up to you as to how you think they're going to look when they come into reality. I'm putting a little bit more around this ankle. Again, I'm leaving the upper area of the ankle, so just here, I'm leaving untouched, but I'm going to go around the back, underneath, and up this side. Now, I am using a size 1 brush for this still. If you want a bit more control over where the paint's going to go, you can move down to something like a size 0 brush, which has, that much smaller head to it, and will give you a little bit more control. I'm comfortable using the size 1 though, so I'm going to stick with that. One of the areas that's going to be different on this model is this claw. As I've said, we're going to do a really dark transition down to this later on. So this is the only area of the model where at this stage I am going to start building up this purple over the entire claw, and I'm going to be a lot more free with how much paint is going on it. And that's because it is going to go so much darker than the rest of the body that it's absolutely fine to start using this almost like an all-over wash, an all-over shade paint instead, and that's because we don't mind as much about leaving the brighter areas. So over here, I'm just going to apply it like it's an all-over wash. And again, I'll come back to that later to help build it up once this layer is dry. Inside the hands are obviously going to be a different colour. I'm going to start to try and imply that there's a bit of shape to the wrist here by applying this in. Then in between the fingers. Again, this is where if you can get your hands together and brace, you can start to paint in amongst the fingers. Again, if you want to use a smaller brush, go for it. And then underneath the wrist here, we've got some shape, the way the arm muscles are showing here. So we're going to sort of build into this little divot in the arm around the elbow. And then underneath the arm here, what a lot of painters like to do as well is they like to edge their model. Now, quite often it's called black lining because you would use black, but it's where you'd have a transition from one material to another. So obviously in this case, she's got an arm band on, which goes into these spikes. So what I'm going to do is where the edge of the material touches the skin, I'm just going to put a little bit of darker colour in there. And the point of that is to help imply that, when something's gripped your skin, so if I grip here, obviously, you can see that there's going to be shadow in between the two things, and the skin starts to tighten and you get a colour change, and that's what we're trying to imply here with this darker purple. And in the chest, again, we're going to imply shape with the collarbone and the neck muscles. And again, up on the face, this is a point where I'm going to transition to a smaller brush, just to be more comfortable, and just so I have a bit more control over the face, because I don't want to flood all the details with lots and lots of paint. I'm just be careful here. I'm just going to touch the paintbrush lovingly to the model, just a little bit of pressure and a little bit of paint to slowly build up how these details are going to be seen. I'm going to go in against the back. And at this stage, you are going to struggle to see too much change if you're using a decent consistency of paint. If you're absolutely using really thick paint, the change will be quicker, but it is then harder to control and go back if you make any mistakes. So I want to be really careful here, so that if I accidentally make some mistakes, and let's say I absolutely swipe my paintbrush across the face, it's much easier to go back and change it if you've been doing lighter layers of paint and gently touching the paint to the model, because you have less areas that you then need to transition back over. We are still going to go back in and glaze our brighter colours back over our transition areas, just to help with that blend and get that effect back into back under control. For the moment, just keep going carefully and gently and applying shape with your paint. Again, I'm just going to use this to almost imply a transition point in between the two materials, in between this anklet and where the leg starts, as I didn't do that earlier when I was completing this leg. What I will do is I'll do the rest of the model like this, and then I'll apply a couple more layers, and as before, I'll show you each time that I start to build up those layers, what it looks like. So this is what our Daemon has started to look like after the first layer of our thinned Slaaneshi grey. Purely for the purpose of this tutorial and to aid with you seeing what I've been talking about, I've just blacked out some of the other non-skin materials that we got some paint on earlier. I wouldn't advise doing this yourself, it's purely so that you can see it easier through this camera. You can see that I've started to get some nice purple, just sort of hinting, showing down around the base of the belly, and again around the face. It's starting to appear in the cheeks. We've got a little bit of build up on this claw. We're going to want to go a lot harder on that in future layers, and obviously under in the armpit and where the chest muscles have started to come across, and amongst the ribs it started to darken. I've also started to darken down the spine, and then some rough shapes just across here where we've got muscle definition and bone sticking through on the shoulder blades. And on this side, we've got amongst the collarbones, we started to tint the colour differently. And then we started to get some purple coming through in the armpit under this side, and again down the side of the chest. Then in the legs, we've got some darker colours where the leg bends here, then down underneath the calves where we'd have more shape, then around the feet and around the toes, ankles, and these rear spikes, and around the little anklet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to darken down these colours a little bit more, again with this just the same mix of paint to water, trying to make it to almost a shade consistency and carefully applying it on. And I'll show you again what that looks like as I get through each layer. I will be darkening primarily, this is the main bit that I'm going to go darker with, and then some of the deeper recesses to get a little bit more depth on the face, and a little bit around the belly and the belly button, and then I'll be moving on to my next colour. I'll show you that in a second. So this is what our model starts to look like when we've got our second layer of Slaaneshi grey on. We've got, again, just a little bit darker around the belly, got a little bit darker on the cheeks, a little bit darker around the collarbones, quite a bit stronger on the claw. Again, I've applied it more like a layer here than a soft shade because I'm going to darken the whole thing down. And I've gone in again around the calves, back of the legs, around the toes, under the arm, in amongst the hands, just to try and sort of, darken that recess in between the fingers down, and added some more definition down the spine and the lower back area, just to imply there is that bit more of a transition in skin tone down here, going around the shoulder blade and around the neck muscles, and again around the back in front of the collarbone. My next step is going to be to start glazing in some demonette hide into the absolute darkest recesses. Now, on a lot of your models, you might not really want to do this if you're trying to keep them to look really bright, like a lot of the Games Workshop box art style. They don't necessarily go to pure demonette hide at its deepest. For myself, though, I'm going to want this in just the darkest areas to really give sort of that purple hue that I associate with Slaanesh onto the model. If you don't want to go this deep, and especially if you really don't want to go down to the Phoenician purple at the absolute, really I'm just talking like 1 or 2 spots of paint on the model with this colour, then I would skip ahead to where I start applying the highlights of Ulthuan Grey and the White Grey, and that will brighten up the rest of your model. But skip ahead to that if you don't want to go any darker. Myself, though, I'll be applying this demonette hide as a glaze. So for that, I'm going to shake my paint again, pop it open, add some of my paint to the palette, and for a glaze, you really want to add a lot of water to this, and you're wanting to almost have no colour change when you're applying it to the model. So I'm going to take my well of water, add more in. I'm going to really get it. So you can see here, if we look at the transition between paint, and then this is sort of what I was using for my soft shade, and that's equivalent. For my glaze, it really is just like water tinted with this purple colour, and that's as strong as you want it. With that, I'm going to go over and just really start to build it up slowly, layer by layer, into the recesses, and I'm going to go quite strongly with it, again almost back to my pure paint, and do another little mix up here, and for that I'm going to build it up on the claw like that. I'll come back to you once I've done those steps. So here is the first layer of the demonette hide having been glazed in. Now there's been several things that I was considering while I was painting it. Obviously I've left a little bit of our Slaanesh grey in between our Celestra and our demonette hide, as I've started to note, it's just creating a very rough transition at the moment. I'll tidy it up later on when we go back to our celestial grey to do some tidying. But for this demonette hide, I focused it in middle of the hand here so that we can get some darker recesses. Get that in focus. Some darker recesses so that you can see where the fingers would be likely to grip something. I've worked the painting down the back of the spine. Again, it helps give even more definition to that area. I've worked it into the cheekbones and under the chin. A little bit of the divot on the elbow just to bring it slightly darker. I've helped add some colour to the central line down in between the abdominal muscles, and also again around underneath the belly where it's next to the cloth. I focused it in amongst the toes and then around the spikes that come out for their claws, and then again around the back in the same way as I have done for the front, and a little bit obviously under on this side. I've done a little bit of the same thing. Key considerations when you're applying this paint are how deep you want that transition to go. So I've literally been applying it in incredibly thin layers, but then much stronger at the top. What I could do to add extra transitions or effect is again just make it a slightly heavier glaze and just slowly work that over the two colours. And what that will do, 3 colours from Celestra through Slaanesh into Demonette Hide, is start to give even more of a transition. But what I was thinking about when doing this is what areas of the body are more likely to collect shadow. So on the face, for example, I've tried to focus the darker paint down the centre. Now when you look at people's faces, if they've got shadows down the centre, it often gives that more aggressive, angry look. So obviously with demons that are snarling, even though they are Slaanesh demons and they do have that sort of allure about them, there is that sort of feral side. So I've really tried to focus shadows down their central line to imply that level of aggression that they do have. And it is starting to bring, with these nice glazes, transitions to the model and actual definition to the shapes. So for example, you can see what I'm talking about with when I was glazing in subtle transitions around this arm. What that's done is it started to imply there are actually muscles there rather than just looking like a smooth, flat grey surface. What I'm going to do now is take my Phoenician purple, as I'm happy with the amount that I've done, even with that just like one, 2 layer, very soft glaze with those areas. I'm going to take my Phoenician purple and basically do exactly the same thing, but almost with just a couple of dots of paint here and there. So in this deepest recess around the back of the leg, I might do a thin line. Right down the bottom of the spine, I'll add in some of the deep purple down there, and I'll be doing it over the end of this claw and to help bring out some of the shapes in this claw. So where we've got spines and recesses, I'll start to apply some in there. You really don't want to go too heavy on this. If you do make a mistake at this stage, it is much harder to clean up because it is obviously a much darker colour. What we've done so far is relatively close and relatively thin to this actual original Celestial Grey colour, so it's going to be relatively easy to tidy up at this stage. Again, don't go any further if you're comfortable with what your model looks like and you're not wanting to do too much deep recess glazing. And I'll put a spot right in the belly button as well, just to help really darken that colour down. So, as before, we're just going to get some. I'm going to use my bigger brush for this. Some on our wet palette. Get some water in there. Put it right down. And then what we've got here is we've got that layer, sort of almost that sort of soft shade transition consistency that I was talking about, and then down the bottom we've got that glaze that's much thinner. So I'm then going to switch back to the smaller brush. I'm going to use this darker glaze, and I'm really just going to sort of touch it into the recess and really not put too much on the model at all. Again, we're going to go up behind this knee, just going to touch it into that recess there. Again, underarm is going to be incredibly dark. We're just going to put a little bit of that purple in there. The Phoenician purple dries a really nice colour as well. So it's going to be dark, but suitable with the rest of the palette that we've chosen. Then, when I was talking about the transitions on here, I'm going to go back to more of this sort of like almost soft shade wash consistency, maybe with a little bit more water in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do more of a wash style effect over everything so that it just catches the recesses And that'll start to help bring some definition while also keeping this claw dark. It's going to tint the surface of the demonette hide, but it's going to settle nicely in the recesses like a wash should, and just give us that darker colour. I might go back over that once that dries and add another one depending on how the consistency looks. Until then, I'm just going to clean my brush off. Just make sure that when I'm going back to this glaze I don't have lots of thick paint built up. And then we go back to what I was doing before, which is just little spots where it's going to be darkest. So again, I was talking about concentrating shadows down the front of the face. So what I'm going to do here is put a little bit of this colour directly under the chin, a little bit down the nose. I'm getting my paint off of my thumb so I can ensure that when I'm touching the brush to the model, I really am only getting the smallest amount of paint on there. So what I'm going to do here for those shadows is just go under the eyebrows, by the nose, and then just a little bit under the lip. Now obviously it does look quite strong around the nostrils at the moment, but we are going to go back and tidy that up. But the demonettes do have a sort of very flat squash nose that isn't very human at all, so it does sort of like help emphasise the alien nature of their faces if they do have that heavier, darker colour in there. And just in the neck, underneath the chin, where it's going to catch loads of shadow. We get some dark purple in there. And then where else? I think under the armpit, under the side, going to get a little bit in there. Just darken that down. And as I said before, definitely down this lower back, bottom part of the spine. I'm really going to just get a darker patch down there. Just carefully add it in. Right where the spine's going to catch these light. And then maybe a little bit, again, down the back here, just to edge the dress where it's going to be matte touching the skin. Just to get a little bit of a definition line in that darkest recess. And then I think for the final area, I'm just going to touch the paintbrush to the belly button. Gets it nice and dark. And just deeper in this recess off to the side where we've got the cloth that's going to cover up a fair bit of the skin. We're not going to run it all the way around because it's not as deep a recess around the whole edge of the dress because of the way the cloth flows up the body. But that looks good for me. And then maybe right up in here, the arm touches the chest, and we're going to get a bit more shadow. And then add a bit more water into my glaze just to make sure that it stays nice and thin. And I'm going to go up inside the hand and make sure that, as I was showing you earlier with my fingers, you've got that super dark line right down the middle. We're just going to carefully add it to the hand and those recesses. That's what I'm going to do for the darkest glaze. Now I do like how this has started to actually catch some darker colours again. What I am going to do is do another layer. Carefully paint in this almost shade-like consistency to the recesses, just to darken down where those recesses are on the claw. Now you can go incredibly dark on this claw if you wanted. You could keep it nice and bright. You could add black in there to really darken it down. I'm just going to go with that hint of purple. I'm going to go underneath as well to make sure that I've got a matching effect on both sides. I'm just going to keep painting it into the recesses. And then just a little bit of a glaze down the length of the claw so that this lower area's got a different colour. I'll do the same thing down this side. And pull that across. And then you can see there starts to be that nice colour transition between the slightly lighter and slightly darker purples along the length of the claw. And we've got more, again, more definition of the shadows. You can just build up. You can add more and more purple in until you're comfortable with the effect. So the next step, and this is where you'll have skipped to if you didn't want to add darker colour, is to start adding in a brighter colour again. So for myself, I'm going to go back up to that celestial grey. That's what I'd recommend. That's what we use for our base colour. I'm just going to make sure that I've got another bit of a water well on my wet palette again that I can pull from. And I'm going to add some water to the spile, a bit of paint. And again, we're just going to make a sort of glazed glaze consistency so that we can use that to tidy up our transitions with other colours. So anywhere that you think you've maybe got a little bit sort of like maybe a water line, a watermark where the glaze hasn't dried properly, or it's dried with a sort of a solid ring around it, like a tide mark, almost as though you've left a ring of like a coffee mug or a tea mug on the table and it's left that sort of dried ring around it. I'm just going to go in and tidy up there. So I'm just going to carefully work my way around the model. So I'm also going to like redefine areas that are brighter, that might have caught some of our colour from earlier. So, lower jawline, around the cheeks on the face. We're probably going to go back on the lips, maybe a bit of the nose. We're just going to work our way around the model, adding some more light back to where we might have accidentally covered up. And the big advantage of keeping all of our purples really nice and pale for the majority of the model is that it means that with almost one layer, even though it's incredibly thin, we'll start to bring that brightness back to the model and it'll look fantastic. I'll come back to you once I've done everything on there in a similar way. So I've reglazed my transitions back up. What I've done is I've done a few little glazes on the claw as well, just to help sort of, bring some of that grey back in along the length of it. I know obviously I wanted to darken it down. Having that celestial grey little bits on it really helps tie it into the rest of the model. I've tied it up more on the face as well, so that we can start to have some of the bright areas back in, and it's not just like, this entire cheek taking up the entire side of this face. It helps to sort of like tie those colours back into the area they're meant to be. Tied it up sort of along the top of this arm. As when the model's actually down, it's going to be flat on the table, so the light will be coming along the top up here. Again, I've tied it up a bit on the shoulder and on the top of the chest, and then just in around, again, just redefining where that belly button is, bring that around there. I wanted to help add some more light to the top of this knee joint, so I made sure that was nice and completely clean, and then I've added in some brighter colours back onto the top of these toes where I'd been a little bit careless with where I'd applied the purple, and same with this side on the ankle. I've added some more colour back in on top, and again, same on the shoulder blades. And just making sure that while the spine is nice and dark and there's some transitions of purple down here, it's not super strong and it doesn't cover all these open sort of like flat spaces on the back. Now we're going to want to brighten up the model with some highlights. So I've left myself some space on the palette to start making my way a bit higher. I know I have got my water well at the top here. If you've run out of space in your palette or you're starting to run out, because it was just water, you can just use a little bit of kitchen roll and remove it. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take some pure Ulthwan grey here, apply it on. Really shouldn't need too much of this because we're going to do some very small highlights. I'm going to get it nice and thin. Again, we're almost looking to glaze with this. It's up to you as to how bright you're going to want to go. You can work your way slowly through glazes or transitions or highlights to get yourself as bright as you want with this Ulthwan, or moving on to the white. What I'm going to do with mine is keep it nice and thin. And I'm just going to go around areas that I think are going to catch the most light and just slowly work on a few dots of this brighter grey. And I want to see how it looks when it dries, because you don't want to go too powerful on your highlights to start with, or you run the risk of sort of obliterating what you've already done. Also, if you go too bright to start with very thick, like strong layers, it's much harder to correct if you have made mistakes. So again, I'm picking areas where it's like it's the top of the knee, it's going to be the top of the toes, it's going to be the top of the arm. Just going to catch, just sort of like areas that are naturally going to catch the light. We're just going to add a hint of colour to. We're not going to go in really strong with this, because skin doesn't have naturally really bright areas that are really strong or go along the entire length of something. It's going to be little bits that catch the light. It's going to be the tip of the nose. It's maybe going to be the edge of where, for humans, we'd have eyebrows. It's going to maybe be just a little tip on the top of the cheek there. And I'm going to go around and do this across the whole thing. So maybe where we've got the joins on the finger, going to be a little bit brighter, because that's where they'd naturally catch the light. Now, one thing you can consider when doing this is that when skin becomes tightened, when you get your knuckles and you really sort of clench, you do get brighter areas here where the skin starts to pull tight. So you can replicate that obviously with muscles across the rest of the body. So if you've got particularly tight muscles in the arm because you're pulling something taut, you're putting a lot of strain on, it might be a little bit brighter. So you can take that into account when you're painting your model, depending on what the pose is or what the model's doing at that time. You know, is it lifting an incredibly heavy weapon? Is it really going to be straining to do that? Again, just almost like a speculative highlight dot on top to imply that light's coming down and reflecting off this shoulder, but it's not going to be doing a huge amount else. You know, I'm not going to want to run a line of white across this, of our pale grey, sorry. Or even if you do transition up to white, you're not going to want to run lines of white across it. Now down the back is going to be a hard area. You know, we're going to have to imagine what's going to catch the light. And I think, as I was just saying with some of the taut skin, that's most likely to be over where the shoulder blades are. So I'm just going to imply some shapes in here with some very light highlights. It really is just designed to imply that there's tight skin, maybe there's some bone structure underneath here. It's nothing more than sort of like lightly touching the tip of the brush to the model. And then maybe, you know, down here where we've got the calf, can imply a little bit of a shape down there. But again, not too much. We're wanting to touch the tip to the model. If you're looking to speed up the process, obviously you're painting an entire army of demonettes. You know, you may be painting 30 or 40 in one go. You're not necessarily going to want to take this amount of time. Do feel free to go a bit stronger on some of your infantry models where people are less likely to pick them up and, you know, be looking at them for that very intricate detail. But on your characters, it's definitely worth taking the time to make sure that when you're applying these brighter highlights to skin, you have put a bit of thought into where they're going. So, you know, I was saying earlier, I transitioned my greys in up here. So again, just to tie it into the rest of the model, I put a couple of little highlights using this brighter grey, just to help build up that impression that it's the same, even though it's much darker, that same style of skin as the rest of it. It helps you bring this natural highlight to a conclusion along the top of this claw here. So, you know, I did one side of the cheek. You want to make sure that it is slightly matching, so you can do top of the cheekbone here just to imply that shape. Again, having these bright highlights under the eyes does imply that the eyes are quite sunken, and again it brings those shadows to the centre of the face and helps keep it aggressive. And again, I'll just do the other eyebrow, or where we would have eyebrows as humans again. And a little bit up the sides of the nose to help imply that strange alien shape. And then a little bit on the lips as well, because those would be proud of the face and sticking out, so are likely to catch more light. Strangely, these demonettes do have earrings, but this model doesn't actually have ears. Maybe a little tip on the chin. Again, helps centre things there. Because when you have something brighter, particularly in something like the face, it actually draws the eye to it. So again, while we've got the deep shadows in the centre of the face for aggressiveness, if you put your highlights down the centre, it draws the eye to the centre of the face. If you put all your highlights up the edge here, and then maybe around the sides, sort of it pulls your eye to either side. So you want to keep your highlights centralised if you can. But for myself, that's all I'm going to do with that in terms of that Ulthwan grey. I am, though, to show you what you can do, going to add a spot of our white grey, which is a Vallejo 70.993, and it is a very nice white grey. It's a slightly off-white, so it's not as pale as White Scar if you wanted. It's not as bright as White Scar if you wanted to go that high. Again, I've got some on my palette, adding some water, mixing it together, keeping it really thin, and on the areas where I've done the absolute sort of like the largest areas of grey highlight, I'm now going to go back in and add the tiniest dot of this possible to the model, the centre of anywhere we've done a little bit of a highlight. And that's how I paint my demonette flesh. Again, as I was saying, you can go much more purple if you want, or you can keep your colours nice and bright. Some other schemes that I've seen that look really good are if you mix as your base colour the Celestial Grey and the Slaanesh Grey together to give the actual base a slight purple hue. But in that case, and this takes again a little bit more effort, I would mix some of your Ulthwan Grey back in just to bring it a little bit brighter again. Even though you've got that purple in, it helps just desaturate a little bit and keep that sort of like otherworldly, ethereal, sort of like tight white purple skin to it. So thank you for watching, and if you've got any questions about this, do leave them in the comments on the video.